happens when mercy becomes a mask for mayhem? When compassion once meant to shelter families becomes the very system shielding killers and predators? That was Chicago in 2025, where sanctuary meant silence and silence meant danger. Dawn over the South Loop broke red and cold police radios hissing as unmarked vans crawled through alleys once thought untouchable. On those streets, the federal government had drawn a quiet line. President Donald Trump's administration had authorized what officials called a corrective strike operation Midway Blitz. The mission reclaim a city that had turned its back on federal law. The story began years earlier when Chicago declared itself a sanctuary city, a symbolic stand against Washington's immigration enforcement. Politicians called it compassion, but beneath the rhetoric, a darker reality grew. Over 800 fugitives, murderers, child predators, and cartel-linked traffickers hid behind that shield. Their crimes spanned decades and continents. Reuters and BBC investigators later described how Illinois' 2021 law banning local cooperation with ICE created an enforcement dead zone. Federal alerts went unanswered. Detainers were ignored. A new class of criminal had learned to weaponize compassion itself. This wasn't a border crisis, it was an internal collapse. Federal officials traced dozens of these offenders to Venezuelan and Mexican networks operating in sanctuary zones, mirroring tactics seen in cartel strongholds south of the Rio Grande. Analysts from Jane's Defense Weekly noted the eerie resemblance between Chicago's situation and early urban insurgencies in South America, small cells using legal protection and political hesitation to expand territory. Globally, the warning echoed far beyond Illinois. In Europe, DW reports showed how similar sanctuary-style policies in parts of France and Germany created safe zones exploited by extremist groups. In the Middle East, Israel's security officials interviewed by The Guardian warned that blurred enforcement boundaries always invite infiltration. The enemy hides where law hesitates. Even in Asia, Al Jazeera compared it to China's domestic control model, where zones of tolerance quickly morph into power vacuums. The balance between freedom and security had tilted. What was once a moral question, how to treat undocumented families, had become a test of state sovereignty itself. America's global credibility hinged not just on defending borders abroad, but on maintaining order within. A sanctuary city that shielded predators signaled weakness, not virtue. The raid that dawn would expose more than criminals. It would expose the price of divided governance in the world's most powerful democracy. Could a nation survive when its own cities defied its laws in the name of morality? Chicago woke to sirens and disbelief. 800 criminals, fugitives, rapists, and gang lords were in custody. Operation Midway Blitz had struck like lightning, ripping through neighborhoods long shielded from federal eyes. The illusion of safety vanished overnight. What began as a promise of protection for immigrant families had turned into an underground fortress for the most dangerous predators on American soil. This was no coincidence. Sanctuary policies had created an ecosystem where federal databases stopped at city limits. ICE agents forbidden from cooperating with local police were left chasing ghosts through legal fog. We were blindfolded by politics, one senior federal official told Reuters. Chicago became the loophole capital of the Midwest. Federal intelligence later confirmed what many suspected organized gangs had learned to read political maps as well as street maps. Venezuelan networks, including Tren de Aragua, exploited Chicago's sanctuary framework as operational cover. According to Defense News, encrypted communications intercepted by U.S. Border Patrol showed these groups discussing Illinois as a low-risk hub for weapons storage and human trafficking. The city's political isolation from ICE enforcement wasn't a barrier, it was bait. The humanitarian dream of sanctuary had been hijacked. What lawmakers envisioned as trust between immigrants and police became a black market truce between criminals and complacency. Even The Guardian reported that internal city memos showed frustration among Chicago police, who were ordered not to assist in federal operations even when violent felons were identified. Officers stood by as wanted killers moved freely through neighborhoods like Pilsen and Englewood. Strategically, the operation revealed a deeper fracture between state and federal power, a clash Trump's administration could not ignore. Washington saw the sanctuary model as a constitutional defiance of federal supremacy. Analysts at Jane's Defense Weekly likened it to NATO's command friction during the Kosovo conflict, when divided authority crippled coordination. In America's heartland, a similar paralysis now endangered millions. The implications rippled outward. Ukraine's war with Russia had already demonstrated what happens when borders and rules dissolve. Militias fill the vacuum. Israel, facing hybrid infiltration from Hezbollah and Iran-backed networks, warned that moral hesitation is a luxury in a security crisis. The same logic now applied within U.S. borders. Sanctuary could no longer mean surrender. For many Americans, Midway Blitz wasn't just a raid, it was a reckoning. Could compassion coexist with security in an era where global criminal networks moved faster than policy debates? The question cut through every statehouse and newsroom. As sunlight hit the skyline that morning, Chicago was no longer just a city. It had become the front line in America's quiet civil war between principle and protection. It took one tragedy to shatter the illusion. Her name was Katie Abraham, a young woman killed when a drunk driver, an undocumented Guatemalan national named Julio Cucul Ball, sped through a red light in the West Side and fled. He was already wanted for prior offenses, but had slipped through every layer of Chicago's sanctuary protections. Her death became the symbol of a system gone blind. When federal officials announced that Operation Midway Blitz was dedicated to Katie's memory, the room fell silent. It wasn't about politics anymore. It was about accountability. ICE Director Tricia McLaughlin told reporters every arrest we make under this operation is one less Katie. Her words echoed across networks from Reuters to BBC News. Compassion without enforcement had turned into cruelty without justice. Investigations showed that Chicago's policy framework had allowed repeat offenders like Cucul Ball to vanish between jurisdictions. State laws barred local police from notifying ICE even after serious crimes. According to DW's analysis, that same model had already failed in parts of Germany where asylum protections were exploited by violent offenders. The parallel was chilling well-meaning rules designed for the vulnerable were protecting the ruthless. The Abraham family's grief triggered something deeper in Washington. Under President Trump, the Department of Homeland Security received direct orders to treat sanctuary obstruction as a national security concern. Federal prosecutors cited Article 6 of the U.S. Constitution, the Supremacy Clause, asserting that no local government could nullify federal law. The White House argued that refusing cooperation with ICE during the height of transnational crime was equivalent to obstructing federal counterterrorism operations. Strategic analysts drew comparisons to the way weak jurisdictions had enabled the rise of hybrid threats worldwide. In Ukraine, fragmented command and local corruption once allowed Russian operatives to slip across borders unnoticed. In the Middle East, Al Jazeera documented how Iranian proxy cells thrived where enforcement lines blurred. Now the United States was learning the same lesson at home. Sovereignty isn't just about borders, it's about enforcement consistency. For Chicago, the cost was personal. Families like the Abrahams saw the system's collapse not as a policy failure, but as betrayal. Children who once played in open parks now walked past makeshift memorials. Their parents asked a haunting question: who protects the innocent when law protects the lawless? As the evening vigils burned through the city, protests erupted outside ICE's Broadview facility. Some shouted for justice, others for mercy. Between the chants, one truth stood clear: sanctuary without scrutiny had lost its moral core. And in the chaos, America faced a choice every superpower eventually meets. Could it defend both its ideals and its people, or must one always come at the cost of the other? At exactly 5:30 a.m., the storm broke. Operation Midway Blitz began with synchronized precision rarely seen on American soil outside counter-terror missions. Dozens of tactical teams, ICE, FBI, Border Patrol, ATF, and U.S. Marshals moved as one across Chicago's south and west sides. Helicopters hovered low over Bridgeport. Convoys rolled silently down Kedzie Avenue. Doors came down in unison as agents stormed safe houses, warehouses, and stash sites. It was surgical, cold, necessary. The target list had been compiled over months of encrypted surveillance and forensic tracing. Not migrants, not families, but the worst of the worst men with histories of murder, rape, child exploitation, and cartel-level smuggling. According to Reuters and Defense News, every arrest was pre-verified by cross-agency intelligence, creating an operation as disciplined as a military campaign. By sunrise, 800 suspects were in custody. Chicago's underworld had been decapitated in less than 3 hours. Inside federal briefings, analysts compared the operation's synchronization to precision strike doctrines used in overseas theaters. Urban Interdiction Jane's Defense Weekly called it tactics refined in counter-cartel warfare applied to domestic law enforcement. Each move mirrored modern battlefield coordination data, fusion real-time satellite imagery, and multi-branch logistics. In effect, Midway Blitz was America's answer to asymmetric criminal warfare at home. Yet the operation was not without resistance. Protesters gathered outside ICE's Broadview facility, chanting "Sanctuary means safety" as buses of detainees rolled out. Some threw projectiles, others attempted to block convoy exits. According to BBC News, several agents reported death threats during the raids. The atmosphere blurred the line between civil protest and open hostility toward federal authority. Globally, security experts saw the echoes. In Israel, where military and police merged during crises, officials told The Guardian that Chicago's case reflected the moral fracture of divided enforcement. In Ukraine, drone footage from Donetsk showed how command unity often determines survival. Even China's internal security apparatus, analyzed by DW, noted that fragmented enforcement is a vulnerability no great power can afford. President Trump addressed the nation hours later from the White House lawn. "No city, no state, no governor stands above federal law," he declared. America's safety is not negotiable. His words resonated across conservative and liberal lines alike. Sanctuary had become synonymous with impunity. For the agents on the ground, the mission was more than an order, it was vindication. Years of political stalemate had finally given way to decisive action. But beneath the tactical success lay an uncomfortable truth. If a city needed a military-grade operation to enforce existing law, what did that say about the strength of its democracy? The sun rose over a city, forever changed its skyline, calm, its conscience unsettled. And one question lingered in every corridor of power: had America just restored order, or revealed how fragile its own unity truly was? What the raids uncovered was far more than local crime. Beneath Chicago's skyline lay a web of transnational power cartels, gangs, and covert financiers operating with the sophistication of insurgent armies. The Tren de Aragua, Venezuela's most brutal criminal syndicate, had built a foothold in Illinois, embedding its members in construction firms, nightclubs, and logistics companies. According to Reuters and Al Jazeera, these networks used sanctuary protections as both camouflage and leverage. They knew local police couldn't coordinate with ICE. They knew federal warrants would take days to cross state barriers. In that time, they moved drugs, weapons, and people across the Midwest like ghosts. Agents described discovering hidden ledgers, fake business registrations, and encrypted remittance trails connecting Chicago to Maracaibo, Mexico City, and Houston. One seized laptop contained direct links to financial operations tied to Mexican cartels, and even crypto laundering networks that routed through Europe and Asia. Analysts at Defense News called it a civilian hybrid battlefield, an ecosystem blending organized crime migration corridors and political sanctuary into one operational theater. The FBI's Financial Forensics Division found over $2.7 million in concealed transfers routed through front companies labeled as community centers. DW later reported that one such business located near Midway Airport was a hub for cash smuggling connected to human trafficking pipelines. The profits traced through cryptocurrency wallets, funded arms purchases in South America, pistols, drones, and even tactical vests similar to those used in cartel conflicts along the US-Mexico border. This level of entanglement shocked policymakers in Washington. What began as an immigration enforcement issue had escalated into a national security breach. Jane's Defense Weekly compared the operation's findings to counterinsurgency doctrines from Iraq and Afghanistan, enemy forces embedded within civilian populations, shielded by political and legal ambiguity. The battlefield once foreign had come home. Globally, the pattern wasn't new. In Ukraine, the blurred line between smuggling networks and military logistics had fueled Russia's hybrid war. In the Israel-Iran shadow conflict, Tehran-backed groups used refugee routes and financial charities to mask weapons transfers. Even in Asia, Chinese intelligence services, according to The Guardian, monitored similar transnational gray networks in Southeast Asia, recognizing them as leverage points in future geopolitical confrontations. America now faced its own version of that same threat. Sanctuary cities were no longer moral zones, they were strategic vulnerabilities. When compassion creates corridors for crime, sovereignty bleeds from within. And yet the debate raged on: could a democracy uphold its humanitarian values without becoming a haven for predators? As ICE buses departed for federal detention centers across neighboring states, reporters watched in silence. Behind the glass sat the faces of men who had turned empathy into a weapon. The silence of that moment carried a warning not just for Chicago, but for every city that thought good intentions alone could hold back organized evil. How many more Midway Blitzes would it take before America understood that internal weakness is the first target of every external enemy? The aftermath was swift and explosive. Chicago's mayor condemned Operation Midway Blitz as federal overreach. Activists called it a human rights violation, but the numbers told a different story. Over 800 violent offenders apprehended, 92 firearms, seized $30,000 in criminal proceeds, confiscated, and 5 confirmed gang networks dismantled. The operation had succeeded where years of political debate had failed. America had drawn a line and enforced it. In the days that followed, protests erupted outside federal buildings. Crowds waved banners reading "No deportations, no raids." But inside Washington, the narrative had already shifted. Reuters reported that President Donald Trump convened a national security briefing directing DHS and DOJ to audit every sanctuary jurisdiction in the country. The message was clear. Sanctuary laws that obstruct federal enforcement would be treated as a national security breach, not a political disagreement. The reaction abroad was telling. European allies quietly applauded the decisive response. DW commentators likened it to Germany's 2015 refugee dilemma, when internal security cracked under humanitarian pressure. In Israel, former intelligence officials told The Guardian that domestic indecision invites infiltration. And in Asia, Beijing's state media, analyzed by Al Jazeera, warned that American federal unity is weakening from within. What began as a local operation had become a mirror reflecting global fault lines between law and leniency, sovereignty and sympathy. Within U.S. intelligence circles, the findings from Midway Blitz ignited deeper conversations. If transnational networks could infiltrate sanctuary cities, could foreign adversaries do the same? Jane's Defense Weekly highlighted the discovery of digital communication patterns linking cartel couriers in Illinois to encrypted servers in Eastern Europe. Experts compared it to hybrid warfare tactics using criminal logistics to mask foreign intelligence movements. The battlefield had evolved. Wars were no longer fought just with soldiers, but with smugglers' servers and sanctuary policies. The human side, however, could not be ignored. Families like the Abrahams mourned their loss, but found a grim solace in justice served. Communities once paralyzed by fear now saw a return of law enforcement presence. Yet the question lingered: at what cost? How far could America push its security perimeter before it breached its own moral core? As the nation debated, President Trump made his stance unmistakable. America's safety will never bow to politics. Compassion without control is chaos. His words reverberated through state houses and city halls alike. Even critics admitted federal enforcement had exposed the sanctuary illusion. Globally, strategists saw the broader significance. Just as NATO reevaluates defense readiness in Europe and Israel fortifies its cities against proxy warfare, the United States was rediscovering an old truth: a country divided on law cannot stand united on security. Operation Midway Blitz wasn't just an enforcement campaign, it was a statement of intent. In the end, Chicago became the warning and the lesson. The balance between freedom and protection had been tested, and the world had watched. Now one question remains: will America's future cities choose sovereignty or sentiment when the next storm comes? Operation Midway Blitz marked a turning point in America's internal security strategy. Under President Donald Trump, ICE, FBI, and DHS dismantled Chicago's sanctuary shield, exposing how local policies meant for compassion had instead become a refuge for the violent and lawless. Over 800 criminals were apprehended in a city long closed to federal cooperation, revealing entrenched transnational networks, Venezuelan syndicates, cartel logistics, and financial conduits spanning 3 continents. The operation's success reignited global debate over sovereignty, morality, and enforcement. International analysts compared the conflict between Washington and Illinois to broader hybrid battles, NATO's disunity in Europe, Israel's urban defense against Iranian proxies, and China's use of legal ambiguity to mass control. At home, families like the Abrahams embodied the cost of political paralysis. Midway Blitz was not merely a law enforcement action, it was a constitutional confrontation. It asked whether a democracy can remain humane without surrendering to chaos. And as the world watched, America's answer echoed across every border: law must stand before mercy, or mercy will bury the law.